On today's program. I'm Molly Gamble, Editor-in-Chief with Becker's Healthcare. The program will begin with a presentation, and we will have a question and answer session following completion of the presentation. You can submit any questions you have throughout the presentation by typing them into your control panel in the space labeled Enter a Question for Staff and clicking Send. Our presenters will attempt to answer as many questions as they can during the time we have, and will follow up on questions they do not have the opportunity to address. You will receive an email within about a week following the webinar that will include instructions for how you can download a copy of the presentation. You will also receive a follow-up email shortly after completion of the program. You can submit your feedback or any additional questions at that time. This email will not include the presentation. It is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Joseph DeLuca to begin today's presentation.
Molly, thank you very much. Thank you in the audience for your participation today. Welcome and good afternoon. Our goal today is to have a candid conversation about the future of the Healthcare Chief Information Officer. Goal is to really examine and discuss this critical issue in our market today and to make this a shared conversation amongst the panelists as well as the audience. In previewing the attendee list, I noticed that there is a very diverse audience today, C-suite executives, academics, and various members of the consulting and software solution and vendor communities, and we'd like to make sure that all perspectives and all questions can get answered. So I think, as we know, the role of the CIO is evolving quickly, both as a result of market pressures, internal demands, the growing digital society and consumer trends, as well as changes being driven by the millennials and the baby boomers. What we'd like to do today in talking about these challenges is to go through a little bit of history, how things have evolved, and how our current leadership, represented by the panel, is helping organizations face these challenges and adapt the CIO role. And in particular, we want to make sure that we focus on how the relationship between C-suite executive teams, with all of the titles that we have and roles and responsibilities today between the CIO, CTOs, Chief Health Information Officers, CMIOs, and CMOs, and even some that are evolving still, can be structured for success. So today, if I could have the next slide, please, our panel includes Zan Calhoun. Zan is an industry veteran and one of the few Chief Information Officers who has moved into significant operating role with Healthcare Partners and DaVita. His experience on all aspects of Chief Information Management, if you will, the hospital, health plan, and risk side, and now has responsibilities for national market development and presence, has been a long-standing mentor to the industry and a colleague to many. Next slide, please. We also have Michelle Hood, who is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Eastern Maine Healthcare Systems and has been a leader in healthcare management, and in particular at Eastern Maine Healthcare Systems, an innovator. Eastern Maine Healthcare System embodies a healthcare model which is aspired by many, continuing the care, collaboration, population health, quality, and cost management. And will talk to us today about how she has seen the IS and CIO role evolving. Additionally, Eastern Maine Healthcare Systems has been one of the 100 most wired organizations, and congratulations to Michelle and Eastern Maine Healthcare Systems on that accomplishment. Next slide, please. I think many of us know and love John Glasser, who has been one of the first in the country to have the Chief Information Officer title at Brigham and Women's Hospital and then Partners Healthcare. His career has a mentor, academician, luminary, and a trailblazer, often on the first point through, if you will, in the informatics role, has been very inspirational to many and a colleague to many. And last but not least on the panel, next slide please, is Paul Kleeberg, who was one of the very early CMIOs, I think probably before Paul even had the title, completed in his work in establishing electronic health records at a line of healthcare in the Midwest. His career has evolved out of the hospital and healthcare system to work in collaborative extensions through the Regional Extension Center, and his current work in resourcing and helping to improve the role of the CMIO in our industry. And next slide, please. And I will moderate today. I've been in the healthcare world since, this will date me, but roughly 1980. When in my first job I was asked to take on the data processing role because at some place I had actually touched a computer. And since then I've been working to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the delivery of healthcare through the use of information technology. And then the next slide. So the way we're going to operate, we're going to go through a 45-minute panel discussion, and I will probe the panel with some key questions, and we would love for your questions to come in so that we can further inform the dialogue and change the dialogue based off of the audience requirements and suggestions. We'll then hopefully hold about 50 minutes open for general Q&A, and as Molly had said, there will be a full webinar recording following this with presentation slides, a dialogue summary, and a response to questions that we're not able to answer during our session today. And the next slide. Thank you. So what I'd like to do is start with a quick discussion with Michelle. And if you would be kind enough to talk a little bit about Eastern Maine healthcare systems, and in particular talk about how you have organized in a diverse environment with both the central structure as well as collaborative organizations, your informatics group and your information officer roles.
Sure, I'd be glad to do that. So EMHS is an integrated delivery system. We have sites of service from the Canadian border down to Portland, Maine, and across the east-west of the state as well. You know, we used to describe our by how many hospitals we have. Probably less meaningful today, but we have 8, soon to be 9 hospitals in the system, anchored by tertiary care center in Bangor, and a number of various sizes of community hospitals, from critical access hospitals up to 200 and 250 bed hospitals across the rest of the state. But as Joe said, we also are into the continuum of care in a big way. We partner with a company that operates with us a number of skilled and nursing facilities and rehab facilities, long-term care facilities. We also own several of those outright attached to other campuses. We have a very active home care delivery network, and of course somewhere around 70 primary care sites scattered around the state, together with some allied health and other services. So, you know, one of the things that I think when I think about the Chief Information Officer role is that it has evolved quite significantly over the past decade in particular, and I think of it much less as a technical role and much more as a strategy officer kind of position. We happen to have our Chief Information Officer position within the transformation division of our organization, and we also have a Chief Medical Information Officer and Chief Nursing Information Officer position within the clinical division. But I think the divisions are less important. The linear kind of functionality of the way we make decisions, the way we do planning, the way we monitor our performance is less and less linear and much more horizontal in nature. So we have integrated informatics and information technology expertise
on each of really the 18 critical interdisciplinary teams that are driving our strategy across the system. In addition, their IT has just undergone a fairly significant reorganization as our system continues to grow, and we have adopted shared services as a way to share expertise across the system in many of what have been considered kind of back office or front office functions. IT has undergone a reorganization that has yielded some regional presence for IT, but also very significant centers of excellence that allow us to share across a broad geography. And then the last thing that Joe asked me just to mention in my opening comments here was the way we use collaboration. We are known, EMHS has been known and continues to be known as a strong collaborator. We really entered population health and kind of came on the national radar screen around our population health strategies when we organized a Beacon Community grant during the federal demonstration project that ended several years ago. That was 17 communities across the country in a three-year demonstration project looking at how we can use clinical information technology and electronic medical records to create new care paths and new care teams and new care protocols. And we reached out and worked with a number of hospitals that are not member organizations of the EMHS and had some very significant wins during that three-year demonstration project. And in fact, our then CIO, I tapped her to be the lead coordinator of that three-year demonstration project. She brought a lot of project management and coordination skills to that effort, and that then evolved into us becoming a successful applicant to the Pioneer ACO project. And last but not least, I put a lot of weight into the great regional collaboration efforts we are working on with Dartmouth, with the University of Vermont, and with Maine Health. We came together and formed a company called the Northern New England Accountable Care Collaborative, which is a predictive analytic informatics company that is building products for population health management. So with that, I'll pause, Joe, and turn it back over to you.
Very, very impressive. So with that extension into really sort of regional collaboration, what does that say for the skill requirements of your CIO? How does the impact of having the need to relate to both internal, sort of the down view as well as the up and now the out view affect the skill requirements?
Well, I think the skill competency set that we really look for, we recently hired a new CIO. Our previous CIO retired. We examined the position description in detail at the time that we were getting ready to go out to the market to look for a new CIO, and really put a lot of emphasis on the team skills, the partnership development skills, both internally and externally. Certainly need to be able to recognize the technical requirements and what keeps us up and running on a day-to-day basis. But with us moving towards everything being digitized, there's not a corner or a nook or a cranny in the organization that our CIO doesn't need to have knowledge of and understanding of. So someone who can work in these high-level 30,000-foot strategy teams, but then able to translate that into real tactics and capabilities. We also have an innovation office, and the CIO and the Chief Innovation Officer do a lot of work here together. We're participants in the High Value Health Collaborative that spans across the U.S., led by Dartmouth, and there's a lot of informatics associated with that work, and more to come, I think, as we move some of those innovations forward. So it's really a dyad capability. Someone who can wear multiple hats, can see things from various perspectives, can certainly bring the technical vision to that, but really bringing so much more in the areas of multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary team strategy development.
Excellent, thank you. If I could move to our next panelist, and Zan, I was wondering if you would be kind enough to give a quick overview of your scope of responsibilities, which are evolving as you move, DaVita Healthcare Partners moves into national markets, and talk a little bit about how you see your role as a sitting CIO and strategist today.
Thanks, Joe. So in the 10 years or so that I have been at Healthcare Partners, where we've moved from being a local company to a national company, I think in some ways I exemplify a little bit of what Michelle was talking about. You know, I've had, in terms of things that were under my responsibility, I've had the entire HR function reporting to me in addition to the kind of traditional responsibilities. I spent about 2 years acting as the Chief Operating Officer for the company while we got ourselves established. Being a national organization, I've been the Chief Compliance Officer during much of that time frame as well. I sat on the senior executive team and continue to sit on the senior executive team dealing with a number of strategic business issues for the organization as a whole. I've had the marketing and sales function reporting to me up through and including where we really sort of put the emphasis on what we have to do on the consumerism side of the house. And today I've got the overall responsibility for all of the 7 or 8 states that we're in for our information systems. And so I think, Joe, that in some ways that background, in my mind, really sort of leads me to believe very much in follow-up with what Michelle just said, that to be successful long-term as a CIO, you've got to have a real good, solid mix of skills. You know, you got to figure out how you get along with people. You've got to have some pretty darn good domain knowledge in a bunch of different areas. You got to figure out how you get stuff done. It's not enough just to sit and go to meetings, but at the end of the day, you're held accountable for getting stuff done. The term that I like to use is you got to be a sociological master. You got to figure out how you deal with all the groups of people and their expectations. And as Michelle alluded to, boy, your partnering skills just better be red hot, because that's the way the healthcare industry is set up. That's the way it works. That's what you have to do to get things done. And so I think in many ways, some of the things that I've done here really kind of parallel and substantiate what Michelle was talking about a minute ago.
Fantastic. I love that term. You described your role once, I think in our prep call, as a cell that was dividing into 3 ways: managing projects, the sociological concerns, if you will, and I believe the third was supporting the business and directly understanding. I was wondering if you could elaborate in particular on, especially in your model, where you're growing through acquisitions, you're converging and merging what would apparently or seem like different business lines. how understanding and managing the business becomes more important, and how you collaborate with your other factors, CMIO, CTOs, and your business leaders on that.
Well, so I think oftentimes when people think of diagrams, when you sort of have three different areas or three different domains that kind of come together, you always have this kind of classical picture of them all being perfect circles and all overlapping nicely and neatly, and life's not that simple, right? Because the circles are always changing in size and are fluid in terms of how much they connect or disconnect from the other circles. And so you have this kind of constantly dynamically changing kind of environment that you just need to be sensitive to in terms of what's your priority today or what's your priority this week relative to trying to keep those three circles in balance. And, it's always, I think an example of that is that, it's always been kind of interesting to me that CIOs typically get held accountable for whether or not a system goes in on time and on budget. And that's literally the very beginning part of the process, right? I mean, what CIOs really should be held accountable for is, did we get the benefits over the long term out of the investment that we made? Did we make the necessary workflow adjustments to be sure that things are done? And that's where this kind of intersection of responsibilities all kind of come together in both the immediate, i.e., did we get the system up, and the longer term, did we drive the value? Did we bring the value to the business that people were expecting? But all of that changes on a routine basis, and boom, you do an acquisition and you're in a different kind of business, and the data needs are different, and maybe in some ways the systems are different, and in some ways the user expectations are different. So it's, to me, Joe, it's all about, you still have to have those three circles, but it's in a constant state of flux, and the successful CIO is somebody that sort of gets that and can sort of allocate their time and their energy and their resources into continuing to managing the relationship among those three things.
So last question, Dan, before I move on. In looking back, let's say 15 years or 20 years to today, in the perspective on those three parts of the dividing cell, or those three overlapping Venn diagrams, my sense is that the technical component, if you will, is now being dwarfed and somewhat overshadowed by the need to understand the business and prove business value. Are you seeing that as a clear accountability, or is this sort of more of a transient trend where we might go back to, well, there's really not real accountability in that area?
So I think there will always be accountability in that area. I think that with respect to the relationship of technical skills to the other things that we've talked about, I think the others have grown. But I think, Joe, I think that the technical accountabilities are still there. Again, whether you like it or not, you have a major breach, and as the CIO, you are going to be accountable for it, even if you are the best strategist and the greatest partnering guy on the face of the planet. You have a data breach, you're accountable for it. So I do think that it's, as I say, there's kind of this nonstop kind of morphing of what those intersecting shapes all look like. And while I do think that there's more emphasis now on additional skill sets and capabilities that organizations are looking for in their CIO, the gum on the bottom of your shoe is that the systems still need to perform. You've got to protect your data, and you've got to deliver the value on a day-to-day basis to your customers.
Excellent. Thank you. And to the audience, I notice that we have questions that are coming in. So I will move through the final two panelists and then start to put the excellent questions coming in out to the panel. So Paul, I was wondering if you could provide some illustration, some illumination to us on a couple of topics. And I forgot to mention in the introduction that Paul Kleeberg is the chair of the HIMSS right now, as well as a sitting CMIO. And when we were doing the previous prep for this, one of the topics that I think you talked about was the role of the CMIO and how that would relate to the Chief Health Information Officer in the care delivery model, and sort of the team-centric care that you saw developing more and influencing informatics. So I wondering if you could elaborate on that for us and how you see the CMIO-CIO relationship evolving.
Sure, Joe, I'd be happy to talk about that. You know, before I do, I'd like to also mention from my perspective some of the things that I see that are consistent in the way the CIO role has evolved and some of the ways it has evolved going forward, and how then I'll move into how they can really partner with the CMIO and potentially with the Chief Quality Officer. But let me start out. You know, as we know, health data right now is really valuable, and I think one of the new things, it's been a classic thing, but it's evolved a bit, is that the CIO really needs to, either they themselves or a security officer needs to make sure that their data is secure. And I should give a little bit more about my background. As a regional extension center, I work with small critical access hospitals and small providers, but we also have some interaction with large integrated delivery systems as well. So some of this is hitting on both of those areas. But as you might imagine, the smaller facilities, the CIO has to wear many, many hats and has to be the chief security officer, whereas in a larger system there'll be a person doing that. The other thing I think that feeds into that in this current era is all this bring your own device. That makes security more challenging, but I think it also creates a new skill for the CIO, so they really need to be on top of this and understand this stuff, because some of their providers and some of their staff persons are going to be pushing the envelope because they really will see how this technology can make their job and everything work easier. And they can be pretty adamant about the fact that wanting to have that information in there. So a CIO, I think, needs to understand the implications of that, both from a security perspective, from a value that it may add in care delivery, but also the risks that it can add to their systems and other things. And finally, I think another classic thing which has also become more significant as a result of the proliferation of EHRs and users of EHRs is the prioritization. Now, this is a place where the CMIO can help the CIO in helping the users of the system begin to think, okay, what are our now top 3 or top 10 items that we want our IT shop to work on? Because otherwise, you know, the demands just keep coming in. The poor IT shop is just doing everything that they can, and unless there's clear organization and prioritization to that, that will create an absolute nightmare. So that's something that the CIO really needs to have, and I believe the CMIO can really help make happen. Finally, some of the new skills, and Zan really mentioned this, and I think it's key, is that the interpersonal requirements of the CIO now are much greater than they were before because the customer base is so much broader. It's not just about business, but it's also about care delivery, and it's not just the providers, but it's also the patients. And again, the CMIO can help the CIO in that there's some knowledge about care delivery. They could begin to translate the technical skills or the technical requirements that the CIO has so that the users can begin to understand that, and vice versa. So that is a very important relationship. But again, the CIO really needs to have, as Zen said, great interpersonal skills in order to be able to navigate what can be a very challenging environment. Also, now that we're up with our electronic health records and patients' lives are depending upon that, uptime is significant. And with all these meaningful use requirements and upgrades that vendors are pushing out in order to meet the new criteria of 2014 certification, et cetera, and when the vendor finds that, oh yeah, well maybe we didn't get it right, so we have another update that we need to push out. I mean, all of this puts demands upon the IT team and the CIO to be able to do it in such a way that it doesn't disrupt patient care. Another key component now is we used to talk, or the CIO would help a lot with business knowledge, but now the role is really we need to understand our clinical knowledge, and there's a couple of ways that has implications. One, again, as we work into value-based reimbursement and we're looking at quality versus cost, a lot of that information is in our information system, and again, the CIO needs to help orchestrate that so that the system, no matter how large or small, can understand their quality, can understand their costs, so that they can be competitive in this value-based reimbursement environment. And also as a provider, which I am, as we now have this exchange going from one place to another, and we have these CCDAs flying back and forth, which have patients' histories, their medications, their allergies, their lab tests, all that stuff, coming from several different places. How do you adjudicate all that information so that you actually have a coherent image of a patient? You know, I liken it to the fact that, you know, if you look at the raw data that comes out of an MRI scan, you just got a bunch of molecules that are reacting to magnets, and it just is absolute garbage. But with a correct system, you can create a three-dimensional image of a patient that you can float through. And I think one of the challenges that we'll have going forward that I think the CIO will need to work on with the help of the Cmio is how do we begin to make sense out of this clinical data so that providers, patients, populations, you can begin to understand actually what's going on. And so how that goes back to how do you build knowledge out of data. And finally, last but not least, patients are becoming, as I mentioned, I think I mentioned before, patients are now a new customer of the CIO. And that's an important component. I mean, many people say patient engagement and how do we get these patients to come to us and how do we get these patients to do the things that we want. But in my mind, that's yesterday's vision. Patients are collaborators with us in care, and it's not that we as doctors or we as providers tell them what we want them to do, but we need to work together to create a care plan that together we both agree makes sense for that particular individual. That's going to have technology issues. That's going to mean that our EHRs and our technology is going to be able to provide information to patients in a manner in which they can consume it and understand it. But it also requires that we're able to receive information back from our patients and our customers so that we can begin to incorporate that into our electronic health record. So to sum up, essentially what I'm seeing is the CIO change is that there is a much broader customer base around clinical care, around patients, around creating knowledge out of data, and not just financial now, but now clinical as well, which is why I think in some instances we're beginning to see nurses and physicians and other folks moving into the CIO arena. So again, to circle back, Joe, on what you were talking about, the CIO and the Cmio have a very, very important relationship because the CIO may not understand everything that goes on in the hospital or in the clinic or in the facility, whereas a good Cmio will be intimately aware of everything that goes on and be able to translate that information or be able to understand what needs to be done to help facilitate the care process, but also do it in such a way that it works within the limits of the technology and works in collaboration with the CIO. So I hope that addresses your question, Joe.
Absolutely, and opened up probably about 12 others. Let me go ahead and focus on one, though. Previously, you made a comment in our prep session that you believe the role of the Cmio will gradually decline, and that the role of the Chief Health Information Officer will expand, if I recall that correctly. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit more, because as what I see going on today, there's sort of a pendulum between what the Cmio is accomplishing, what the CIO is accomplishing, and now what the new Chief Digital Officer, if you will, the sort of new function coming into healthcare, primarily from the non-healthcare sectors. So I wonder if you could just quickly elaborate on that.
Well, when we talk about the Chief Health Information Officer, I think what we're talking about here is a natural progression of having the physician be the center of care to actually having the team and the patient all be involved in the care process. So it's not just that it's medical-centric, but it's health-centric. And when you look at the way reimbursement is moving, where we're looking at value for care and keeping people healthy and keeping them out of the hospital, we're not just looking at how do we fix them when they're broken, but how do we keep them alert, how do we keep them active and vibrant within their own lives and keep them healthy. So I think that's one of the reasons why we're beginning to see a change from the Cmio onto something more like a CHIO, or Health Information Officer, because of our change in perspective on care, the care process itself.
Excellent. Thank you. I'd like to now turn to our last panelist, John. And John, I'm wondering if you have a very unique perspective, having come up as the CIO of, and I believe probably one of the first in the country to actually have that title, to then move to a multi-system perspective, then over to a software solutions perspective, and now evolving that further. So from your perspective, John, how has this role evolved? Where do you see it going, and what kind of pressures are on this position?
Well, thank you, Joe, and it's a pleasure to be here. And a couple of comments, and sort of based on the fact that, like several of the panelists, and presumably a number of the people listening in, I've been in this industry for several decades. And as Joe mentioned, was a CIO for 22 years. I've been in the vendor community for about the last 5, and was involved early, and this goes back to about 1990 with the creation of CHIME, which is the Healthcare CIO Professional Society. And you could perhaps argue that that was sort of the dawning of the era of the CIO in the healthcare. And I think a couple things that we've seen, if you go back over time and you look across multiple industries, one is that there's always been an evolution of this role. So if you go back into the 80s, for example, we're beginning to see the evolution from the Director of Data Processing to the VP of MIS to the CIO. And all of that was a recognition that the IT function was moving from the back office, running the payroll, inventory and stuff like that, into a function that really could support and enable critical organizational strategies. And at the time, there was a lot of academic study of organizations like American Airlines and Bank of America and USAA and Federal Express, all of which had used the technology to really advance a competitive position and improve their performance. And we have more recently seen other evolutions, some in healthcare, some across a broader set of industries. So in the last 10 or so years, we see the Chief Technology Officer role evolve, and that's largely a recognition of the growing complexity of the technology and the criticality of the technology providing really good reliability and agility as the environment shifted, and also coping with a diversity, such as the advent of personal devices, personal computers initially, and now more mobile phones. So the CTO came into being. And in healthcare, we saw the advent of the CMIO and the CNIO as we recognize the critical role and the need to engage the clinical staff in using these systems to improve care, whether it was CPOE or the ambulatory record, but realized that you had to have some set of folks who had both a clinical background and training, but also were able to have the IT conversation. And we will continue to see the evolution of the role in some more of the recent efforts, some of which have been mentioned. You see industries generally outside of healthcare, the advent of the Chief Marketing Officer being responsible for IT, and this is largely in consumer products companies where they see the role of social media, communities online, but they also see the role of, just like Amazon, using intelligence to guide you on your transaction and suggest other things that you might want to buy, is the use of sites for purchasing and finding products and steering you to other opportunities to extract money from your wallet. So you see the CMO, different meaning of the term there. And to the point that Paul just mentioned, that the Chief Health Information Officers, people say, golly, the role is evolving from purely medical care to health care, and particularly not just health care, but health. And in some cases, we see the Chief Digital Officer, and these are on the part of organizations that say, golly, IT is just everywhere. It's hard to turn the corner or find a function that doesn't rely on technology. And so we're looking at the digitization of all that we do, not just IT, but the digitization, even if the boundaries between that are kind of fuzzy at times. And then last but not least, recently, we've seen the advent of the Chief Information Security Officer as people confront, geez, I don't want to wind up like Sony or Anthem with a security nightmare on my hands. So we've seen this evolution over the decades, and we will continue to see this evolution. So we could have this call 10 years from now, and we'll say, golly, there was additional evolution evolution and creation of new IT-centric types of species that will go on. And this will be particularly critical as the technology becomes of a potency and a diversity that it touches everything. It's not just the back office as it used to way back when, but it's also devices in the patient homes, devices in the car, and increases in sensor technology, et cetera. So that's sort of one observation, is that we ought to expect that the role will increase and the importance of having IT embedded in everything goes forward. So I think there's a couple of sort of core conclusions of this. One is that if you are a CIO, you ought to expect that the role will continue to evolve. Now, you may be close to retirement, and that's fine. You don't need to move. But if you're earlier in your career, you ought to expect that you will have to do several more evolutions that have to, occur, and that will require that you recast yourself. You also would expect to see that there will be continued evolution of sort of IT-oriented senior leadership functions like the Cmio that will blossom. Wouldn't be surprised if we see a chief function devoted to population health informatics as we collectively get further into that, or as we begin to transform the organization with new organizational care models, patient-centered medical homes, accountable care organizations, that we'll see CIOs who have more of a orientation, or chief IT functions that are more of an orientation to how do you put together new care models such that they work well together. So we will see both the evolution of the CIO role, but also the creation of complementary type of senior IT leadership roles that need to go on. That being said, I would agree with a number of the comments that have been made that regardless of the evolution of the role, the incumbent or the individual who's advocating has to increasingly exhibit the skills that you would expect out of any senior leader, whether it's the CEO or the CFO, and that is broad strategic abilities, great communication skills, terrific leadership skills, the ability to get things done at the end of the day. So that's sort of things that make great executives that will be increasingly absolutely essential for the CIO, just as it's essential for the CEO, the CFO, and the chief medical officers. I do think that regardless of the sort of evolution of the roles and the advent of the senior leadership skills, there's still an IT core that will sit there. That is, systems have to work. They have to be up. Users have to say, by and large, they're not bad, or they're better, they're even terrific at supporting the work that I do. So the notion of running infrastructure, making sure implementations and projects get done on time will remain essential, as will the ability to help the leadership engage in a fairly strategic discussion of new IT opportunities. So you had better be prepared in a senior leadership discussion or a big discussion when someone says, what's the role of big data in healthcare? You better have a coherent answer to that, even if we're still learning, but be able to talk about that, or to talk about how effective various technologies are at helping people manage chronic disease. So both the strategic understanding of the technology and the ability to keep the trains running and to get new trains on the track remains relatively essential. And then last but not least, one of the core things, and agree with a number of comments too, notably Michelle on this, is that you have to realize as the CIO, or however that role evolves, is that you're going to share this responsibility with others, because whether it's the CS, the Chief Security Officer, or the CMIO, or the population health informatics person, whatever, you won't have the domain knowledge necessary to span the true spectrum here. Others will, and you have to be able to share and work well with those folks. And also with the fact that increasingly, as the leadership matures and grows up, increasingly those in leadership positions are actually quite comfortable with IT. They grew up with the PC, or they grew up with mobility or the web, et cetera. And so unlike some of their predecessors who were gun shy of this kind of stuff, they're quite capable and quite knowledgeable about the topic. So you have to share the leadership and the direction with folks who are actually very far along on the learning curve and the sophistication skills. So the notion of being collaborative and inclusive and leading a team through influence becomes essential. So we'll continue to see this role evolution and the creation of complementary roles. You can guess at what they will be in the years ahead. We'll probably know 10 years from now. And again, the stakes of being the consummate professional continue to get raised, just as they do for all members of the healthcare leadership team.
Excellent. Thank you. Before I start some audience questions, John, one quick question. Now that you've been on the solution provider side, what insight do you have that you didn't have before as a sitting CIO?
Well, I think one is being a vendor is hard, and so one is just to appreciate the difficulty and the challenges that when you are a vendor that you face, and particularly when you have a very large customer base, and particularly when you face a industry that's in flux and in transition. So there you go, and it's not to draw a sort of a woe is us, but I didn't quite appreciate the challenges that the vendors face. The other thing you get to see as a vendor is because of the wide range of customers, you see some who are really quite exceptional at using the technology and some who are really not very good at it. And so and despite the fact that it's the same software and more or less the same teams implementing, you appreciate the range of organizational sophistication and competency at applying the technology. And so that's just startled at times, and one tries to go out of their way to help all of that kind of stuff. But you realize how critical it is that the organization itself, broadly speaking, it's not just a person, but it's a team effort, develops its competency at leveraging the technology, realizing that the vendor is a partner, a terribly important one, but a vendor cannot, per se and alone, carry an organization across the finish line and enable true clinical excellence or efficiency and stuff like that. So, I mean, those are just a couple of observations.
Excellent, thank you. Let me start fielding some of the questions from the audience. So, question focused to John and Zan, and I think, John, you elaborated on this a little bit, but how would you define the differences between a CIO, a CTO, and a Chief Security Officer, in brief?
Dan, you want to start?
Well, yeah, I mean, just sort of in general, a Chief Information Security Officer has a reasonably well-defined domain, specifically around risk, and for those people that have to deal with Sarbanes-Oxley, yeah, that sort of falls under that definition as well. So I think the CISO really has as probably the most defined turf, because it is all about risk prevention or risk mitigation at so many levels. But I think it's easier to put in a box. A CTO, at least in my mind, is a little bit harder to sort of differentiate from the CIO. And so I would differentiate it almost by exclusion. At the end of the day, the CIO is the one that's got responsibility for the whole shooting match. And you can carve out a couple of pieces like security and some other things. CTO's got to be involved in just a ton of things, not just working in isolation, but again, what kinds of products, what kinds of tools, how about future direction, what are we trying to do in terms of matching our technology up with our consumers, with our patients, as we heard. And so I think it's a harder line in my mind to differentiate between a CTO and a CIO.
A little bit of that. I think you do see variation, and you see the same title, CTO, but differences in terms of what people interpret that to mean, and the roles that they assign, just as you do in a CIO. I mean, from my perspective, the CTO has got a sort of core technology and technology strategy orientation. So if you say, listen, we're in a health system with a lot of different EHRs out in the community, we've got to get some degree of interoperability. What are some of the technologies and the standards that are available to us to do that, and how effectively do they work? Similarly, you can get a new class of mobile devices out there and say, golly, it sounds pretty cool. Everybody's all excited about this stuff. Should we move aggressively towards that or not? So very core tech questions of strategy, but also implementation and management of this stuff. Is this some of this stuff lead to a better total cost of ownership, or than others? You turn to the CTO to sort of really help that. We expect more of the CIO to say, I understand and can facilitate the broader strategy, the discussion of the organization, and what we are going to do to help further that. I also, as the CIO, need to make sure that large implementations and small implementations are going well. And similarly, if we expect certain value to result, quality up and errors down and days and receivables down, am I working with, or are we collectively working as a leadership team to enable those IT-enabled gains to occur? You do see overlap between those, and you can see variation in both people's interpretation of what they want the role to do and to be.
So historically, 10, 15 years ago, that was embodied in one individual, and the CIO really had to do both at a practical level as well as a strategic level. What I hear you saying is there's a separation still across accountability, but the technology side has just grown in specificity, as well as really the emotional intelligence needs of the CIO and the social needs, so that they've grown apart, for lack of a better word. Would that be a fair statement?
I'll start and others can contribute. I think that's true. In addition, the technology range has increased. So, I'm old enough to remember when there were no mobile devices, or when the mobile devices were BlackBerries. Now there's just this unbelievable potency and range of mobile devices, and now we're talking about the Internet of Things, where you say actually the intelligence isn't, or a computer isn't in a device, it's ambient, it's in your environment, it's in your house. So your house is a computer, and it's surrounding you, your car is, and things like that. So as it becomes more critical, but also just broader in its range and its power, I think you increasingly say I can't have, or I can't rely on one people to master all this. The analog we see is in medicine, with the growing specialization in medicine, because the knowledge base required to be a specialist just keeps getting broader and broader. So you wind up having to subspecialize just to give a human being a shot at getting all of this in their head and developing proficiency.
Thank you. A question from the audience for Michelle and Paul. You hear a lot about culture in the work environment. How can the CIO best influence or be part of culture in an organization? So I think looking for some practical advice.
Yeah, so I'd be glad to give my 2 cents there. I think that the CIO has a set of competencies just because of their training and their ability to see the organizations from various perspectives, looking across processes, looking deeper into the organization more on maybe a vertical way about how technology influences care, that they probably have a capability that is unique in the C-suite to being able to bring early indicators of things that are going well in the culture so that they can be replicated where appropriate, and also things that maybe are working contrary to the organization's stated values and culture. So I think that perspective, not just the individual eyes and listening skills and so forth, but as the CIO's team, the areas that he or she oversees are oftentimes in a position of being embedded in many of the areas of the hospital as a team member. And so they bring that capability of being able to distill, filter, and be a voice of cultural wins and potential cultural problems in the organization.
I agree. And this is Paul. There are a couple of things that I think the CIO can do to influence culture, and one of which is to actually be able to clearly state the vision for the organization and how the information technology that they're implementing and they're working with can help realize that vision. And that needs to be, as Michelle said, into the C-suite, but it also needs to be into their staff and beyond, because their approach, they can help influence their IT staff and their IT staff that come into contact with the folks across the rest of the system. Again, their approach can begin to change that culture. One of the other things that I think is important to do is that we found it, and I found it very effective for the folks who are working in IT to actually spend some time when they're in a healthcare environment in the clinic or in the hospital so that they can actually see what goes on in the environment. It gave them a much better idea and clue as to how things are really operating out, quote, in the wild, close quote. And I think, we don't want to overpromise and underdeliver, but I think sometimes technologists either say they either overpromise, or else when a user requests something, we can't do that. We put up barriers. But I think some of the best folks are the ones that listen and try and understand and come up with ways that they may be able to accomplish something that might not be traditional. So again, I think the CIO can affect the culture both by helping provide the vision of why we're doing this, and both up and down, and also that their staff have that vision and their staff have an openness to user requests, not promising stuff they can't do, but openness and listening to the requests so that actually providers and the users feel like they're listened to, and that the IT department is not a barrier but rather a colleague.
Thank you. Here's a question to the panel. Would you agree that the CIO-CMIO relationship is the single most important relationship on the delivery side in driving towards the triple aim goals?
This is Paul. I'll just do it quickly. I would actually add another individual to that, and that's the Chief Quality Officer. I do agree the CMIO and the CIO is a very key relationship. But again, the quality officer, if they're not just looking at JCO, but they actually have a vision of where they want the organization to go, and they're really paying close attention to the numbers, that's what's going to drive the organization towards greatness. So I do believe the three of them need to work very closely together in order to help realize the vision and make sure that the ship is heading in the right direction.
Just a comment, Joe. I think it's obviously a very important relationship and a critical one, frankly. And if you have a bad one, that's not helpful at all. The thing I'd want to be a little cautious of is if you're the CIO, you have lots of important relationships. You better be on good terms and a good colleague with the CFO, with the Chief Operating Officer, with the CEO. So, like any good leader, you need to manage a lot of relationships because it requires, particularly when you're in a time of great change, all of that's got to come together as a highly effective team for things to get done. So the CMIO one, very important, but don't be careful about saying, golly, I got a great relationship with my CMIO, I'm good. You may not be good at all, or you're not serving your organization well at all. So just realize that there are lots of relationships that really matter and are very important to be very effective.
I would echo that. I don't know that I could pick out one critical relationship. I think several of us have mentioned during the past 45 minutes or so how strong the competencies around being part of a team need to be for this position to be successful, just like everyone else in the C-suite. So relationship development and course correcting when the relationship is not good because of unintended interpretations or whatever might have caused it are really important. So that capability of communication, interpersonal communication with multiple members of the team.
So this is Ann. I would answer the question by saying, if what you as an organization want to have are great information systems, they are predicated, in my mind, on two things. One, having great leadership in your organization, and secondly, having great processes in place so that when you automate, you are automating great processes. So whoever you have to align with, to be sure that you are aligning with great leadership and people that will give you great processes, those are the people you have to align with, because you'll result in better systems at the end of the day.
Excellent answers. So a couple of thoughts as we move into the last 90 seconds to 2 minutes. I was looking today at a list of CIOs who recently retired in our industry. It's a long list. And I would ask the panel for a couple of quick responses. Number one key skill that organizations should look at in recruiting in. And second, is the retirement an opportunity to change the structure and the role, which is a different way of saying, is there a different structure that should be there? Start with the first one. Number one skill.
Ability to deal with ambiguity.
I'll vote for that as well.
I would go with the ability to work with others and collaborate so you get what you need.
I think those are the right skills. There's a lot of skills. So I think if the leadership team is interviewing someone who's a prospective member of that team, would they collectively say, I would really enjoy working with this colleague. They have the right material, the right stuff, the demeanor, the interpersonal skills, et cetera. So it's this mosaic and composite. But if the team doing the interview comes out excited by the individual for a whole bunch of different reasons, then I think that's the sort of secret sauce you're looking for.
And the last question premised by the fact that today, as I do my accounting, 50% of the CIOs report to the CFO and do not have C-suite visibility, if you will. Is the role of the CIO continue to grow in significance and importance to the organization, or is it at its hiatus today?
I personally think it's going to grow and expand, just because, as somebody was saying earlier, technology is going to get so infused in everything we do. I would expect it to grow.
This is Paul. I agree.
I agree.
Yeah, although I think, one of the things every now and then hear from CIO colleagues is say, well, I'm a CIO, because we're a strategic asset, we need to report to the CEO. I say, oh, for God's sakes, everybody and their brother wants to report to the CEO. Person overwhelmed. I think, frankly, reporting to this, first of all, you can be highly effective reporting to a CFO and a Chief Operating Officer, assuming you have the right CFO or Chief Operating Officer, who understands the broad intention here, the needs, and gives you access to the board or the C-suite as necessary. So I don't think, per se, it's often as if you've been banished to some island remote. That isn't true at all. It can be by the individual, but not necessarily inherently by the role. The second, I think, access to the C-suite in general is earned because they look to you. And a number of examples, and being an example of a great executive who said, golly, this guy's great, let's give him this and let's give him that, et cetera. So you earn the right, and they say, we want this person in these conversations because he or she's really good at helping us think through this or think through that. So I'm not sure it's an entitlement. It is earned, and I think regardless of where you wind up dotted or first of all, regardless of where you wind up solid, it's not inherently a death sentence one way or the other. And frankly, it goes back to the other point. When you're at that level, you got dotted lines all over kingdom come, and that's fundamentally what you have to manage.
Excellent. Thank you. To the panelists, thank you very much for your participation today, for your experience and your contributions. To the audience, looks like we have about 10 or so unanswered questions that we will answer and push out in the written response from Becker's within the next week or so. And I would now turn the podium back over to Becker's for closure.
Thanks, Joe. So thank you again to presenters for an excellent presentation and for all of you for participating today. We look forward to having you join us for future webinars. This concludes today's program. We hope you have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.